Hi, my name is Lena and welcome to my channel. I am doing the vintage sci-fi and fantasy genre type. And we have my cat here nearby, but he refuses to be in the video. So, I'm doing the vintage sci-fi and fantasy tag. I was tagged by Richardson Reads. I will leave a link to his video in the info box. As I understand it, all the books I can choose from should be printed before 1979. So, first question is, what is the first vintage sci-fi book you ever read? And I think it was Professor Dowell's Head by Alexander Belyaev, or probably The Amphibian by Alexander Belyaev. In Professor Dowell's Head, he was exploring what exactly make us the human we are. I mean, our brains or our heart. What will happen if only our brains will survive? It was a very interesting story. And in the Amphibian, we have a young man who, as a child, was saved by a scientist. This scientist made a transplantation of gills of a shark to this boy, to this young man, in order for him to survive. It's a very interesting and moving story too. What is the first fantasy book you ever read? And I think it was a big hardcover of novelettes, and the hardcover was called Conan the Barbarian by Robert E. Howard. It was translated into Russian and it was printed in Russia. What is your favorite vintage sci-fi and fantasy book? And it's my favorite sci-fi book, I think Tunnel in the Sky by Robert Heinlein. And my favorite fantasy book is The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. To tell you the truth, guys, apart from the Conan the Barbarian, it's the only vintage fantasy that I have read. What is your favorite vintage sci-fi or fantasy book cover? Guys, books that were printed in Russia at that time, they were not pretty. They were very ordinary. You couldn't tell apart a sci-fi, a detective story, a serious classical literature. You couldn't tell them apart. They were pretty similar looking. Which vintage sci-fi or fantasy books are on your TBR? So, about fantasy. I have yet to read The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, Silmarillion by Tolkien, and I think The Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny. Well, I'm pretty sure there are many, many wonderful fantasy books I have no idea about. So I ask you guys to comment and to tell me in your comments what books, what vintage sci-fi and fantasy books I absolutely should read. Please do. About sci-fi, on my TBR is all of the Anne McCaffrey's books, all her Dragon Riders of Bern books, all the vintage classics, all the American vintage sci-fi classics, C. Clarke, Philip K. Dick, Asimov, Robert Sheckley, Heinlein. I'm sure that there are more, and I ask you to tell me about it. I also want to reread some Russian vintage sci-fi. I will leave links to all the books I will be able to find in translation on Goodreads for you if you are interested of Russian vintage sci-fi. So I want to read Belyaev, I want to read Aleksey Tolstoy, I want to read Bratya Strugatsky, I want to read Bulgakov, Mikhail Bulgakov, his sci-fi, and I want to read more of vintage sci-fi by Stanisław Lem, who is a Polish writer. So, how many vintage sci-fi books have you read in the last year? 0. Actually, a book by Anne McCaffrey, this Dragonflight, is my first vintage sci-fi that I have read during the year. How many vintage fantasy books have you read in the last year? I reread The Lord of the Rings, all 3 of them. Thanks to the guys from Strip Coverlead and Steve Donahue who held read-alongs. Where do you buy vintage sci-fi and fantasy books? Whenever I can find them. So mostly online, and unfortunately mostly on Amazon Kindle. Well, okay, once again, I forgot to tag people. Let's tag somebody. I tag Mel's Bookland Adventures, and I hope you will be able to do it with your husband, that you both can talk about vintage sci-fi and fantasy books you have read. I tag Marsha Osborne, I tag Todd the Librarian, and I tag Britta Böhler. I'm sorry if I butchered your surname. Thank you for watching, goodbye, and happy reading.